Okay, so g'day, and welcome to AMN 405. Welcome to Decisions and Issues in IMC. Welcome to Tutorial 4. We're going to be talking today about message and media strategy, going through the modes of persuasion. This is going to be one of our decision areas, or this is going to be two of our decision areas. So this would be an important thing to cover. We're also going to be doing a quick Q&A about Assessment 2, just so that everyone is all up to speed on that. So if you do have any questions, feel free to ask them. Of course, I am Robert Mitchell. You can contact me via r20.mitchell@qut.edu.au. So if you do have any questions, particularly if you're watching this recording later and can't participate in any of the group work or ask questions right now, obviously send me an email. That's great. As I mentioned, I wanted to do a quick Q&A about the second assessment, because I've been getting a lot of questions about that, about what constitutes as a hot topic, what even constitutes as one of the decision areas. So I thought I'd work you through that real quick before we get too stuck into anything else. So this here is last week's slides about the IMC hot topic assessment. It's a portfolio assessment. So you're going to do sort of 5 little mini bits. So it helps to get started on this as soon as possible, right? All of the detail, obviously, you can find under Blackboard. And last week, Frank did a really good job of walking through all the key details. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that tutorial yet, the recording should be online. But the basic idea of it is you are going to be doing 5 different decision-making areas, and you're going to be describing a hot topic in each of those decision-making areas. And just a reminder, the 5 decision areas, this is all on Blackboard, but the 5 decision areas: setting objectives, role of IMC tools, message strategy, media strategy, and measurement in IMC. So what a hot topic is just anything that's affecting IMC decision-making in this area. And it really can be anything. I've had a lot of questions as to whether or not something is or isn't acceptable. So if you are confused at all, please do send me an email. I'm more than happy to help. But it is very open to interpretation, right? So when it comes to setting objectives, it might be new technology that allows us to capture, for instance, impressions and engagement and things like that. Now, obviously, in and of itself, that's probably more of a measurement in IMC affecting issue. But if you specifically want to talk about, and the articles that you can find, because as a reminder, you need to find 1 to 3 articles per hot topic. If the articles you can find are more about how you incorporate metrics such as engagement in your objective setting, you know, like what is the worth of these things? How useful are these new tools in, for instance, linking IMC activity to sales objectives? Because obviously, predominantly in IMC, we're using communication objectives because there's a lot of factors that go into making a sale. So it's a bit difficult to directly say, well, the sales went up or down because of IMC activity. Whereas communication objectives, things like liking preference or knowledge about a particular product, these things are far more directly linked to IMC activity. So it's a bit easier and more useful to use those as objectives. But of course, if we've got all these new tools, they allow us to measure things in different ways. What impacts will that have on the setting of objectives in IMC? You know, all these new digital technologies we have access to, how do these affect how we think about IMC tools now that it's possible to run entirely online campaigns, particularly in an era of COVID and lockdowns, you know, which will probably continue well into next year. Even if there is a vaccine rollout, it's likely that we'll have on and off again quarantines until it's all done and dealt with. So, you know, it might be a year, might be more. What does marketing look like? What do the IMC tools look like when you can't expect that everyone's going to be out of the house? So there's obviously a lot of interesting topics that are taking place in the world today, but as long as they're contemporary, which is to say that are of ongoing importance and interest, you can talk about pretty much anything that you want to, as long as you can find articles. People have asked me where to find these articles. That's, you know, you just Google search things, you watch the news, you pay attention to what's going on, and things will come across your lap. It's a bit difficult to say exactly where to look because, you know, the world is full of news. It's happening all the time. We live in history. So it's difficult to point you in any particular direction. Just try keyword searching, particularly news aggregate sites like Google News, and you'll find a lot of interesting things. If you are looking for good like industry publications, Mumbrella online is a very good one to look at. It's all about media and communications in Australia, and so they do often go into contemporary IMC issues. Obviously, follow the QT sort of different social media accounts. They're often sharing interesting news stories about all sorts of things. So yeah, you can find all sorts of articles. I've just got a question here from Elizabeth asking how recent these articles need to be. That's a great question. It doesn't really, I don't have a set date, right? As long as the issue is contemporary, and you can construct a good argument as to why it's still important today. I don't really mind if these articles are, a few years old. I'd avoid anything that's more than 5 years old, because 5 years ago, I mean, these last 5 years have been pretty hectic, right? A lot has changed in this world in the last 5 years. So, how relevant can it be if it's more than 5 years old? But, if it's 3 or 4 or something like that, as long as the issue is still contemporary, as long as it's still important, that'll be fine. And even if they are older, provided that you can find some articles that are more recent or some good, compelling reason as to why this is still a contemporary issue, that'll be fine as well. And just a quick refresher, when I say contemporary, I really do mean just of ongoing importance. You're essentially saying that in IMC right now, if I was making a decision in these 5 key decision areas, I would have to consider this hot topic, if I was doing this project right now, which is why I say it doesn't really matter if your articles are a few years old, if the issue is still an ongoing issue, right? If it's still an evolving issue. Obviously, the more recent, the better. That's just a general rule of thumb. If it's still being talked about in the last week or so, then it's obviously very contemporary. But I'm more than happy to leave it to your discretion as to how old these articles should be. Just make sure that the topics are interesting and engaging. And then Frank covered everything else really, really well. So the portfolio format, it's all available on Blackboard. You just go through, do it like this. And it should be fine. The CRA, he also did a very good job of explaining with the different overviews. I think that's a different version of the CRA, but you can find all the more relevant stuff on Blackboard. You really are just putting together a portfolio that shows that you understand what's going on in IMC today. Particularly at QT, we're really interested in you having an understanding of the world that isn't just from a textbook. Even the most contemporary textbook, obviously they get updated every year, but even then a lot changes in a year, and they don't have room to cover everything. So this is your chance to sort of demonstrate your ability to go out and do your own research and sort of put your finger on the pulse of what's happening in IMC and get a very up-to-date contemporary view of how these 5 decision areas look outside of the basic theories and principles that we obviously teach you through the tutorials and the lectures. So yeah, like I said, I just wanted to give a bit of an overview and address some of those key issues about, like where to look and what sort of topics count, because I was getting a lot of questions about that. Perhaps if you guys have any other quick questions about this second assignment, we can cover them now, and then we'll move on to the message strategy and media strategy decision areas. Was there anything about last week's tutorial that wasn't clear? Is there anything else that you want more specific feedback on? Is there anything that you're not sure about? No? All right. Well, in that case, we'll move on. If you guys do have any other questions, like I said, just unmute yourselves and ask, or feel free to type something out in chat, and we'll deal with it as it arises. So today, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be moving on and looking at these decision areas. We're going to be looking at message and media strategy. Very, very briefly, these get covered in a bit more detail in the lectures. We're just doing an overview of some key concepts. Probably with a bit more of an emphasis on message strategy, because media strategy is a bit more, it was specific to the campaign, right? And it links very closely to message strategy, because a lot of the time, the best media to use, you make that decision on a combination of an understanding of your target audience, which is obviously very specific to the campaign and difficult for us to cover, and also message strategy. So understanding whether or not you're making an emotional appeal or a logical appeal, and therefore whether or not you want a lot of visual imagery and dynamic imagery and things like that. And again, that's very specific to campaigns, so it's a bit difficult to cover as sort of like a broad overview. But we will be touching on those things. And like I said, a lot of detail on message strategy with a particular focus on appeals and modes of persuasion. So let's get stuck into that. So just as a quick overview, when we talk about message strategy, because this does confuse some people, I've just added this slide in as a result of some emails that I got just before this tutorial. Message strategy, when we talk about message strategy, we're talking about the underlying meaning of a campaign, and a campaign in the broader sort of definition of the way of thinking of it in IMC is a series of media communications based around a message strategy, based around a sort of similar thing that they're saying. But it's important to note when we say, you know, what the campaign is saying, we're not talking just about the verbal or the taglines or the actual spoken word of an advertisement. We're talking about the meaning behind all of that communication, right? We're talking about the visual message as well, the feelings of comfort in the color palette. We're talking about the way that the actors hold themselves, their body language, as well as obviously the things that they say and the things that are written down and come across the screen. There's a unifying message behind these things, and it usually speaks to something, some insight that we have into the target audience, an understanding of why they behave in a particular way. And then we craft a message strategy that is essentially the most persuasive thing that we can say to those people, bearing in mind this insight we have into the way that they make decisions. And that's really what message strategy is all about. It's all about being persuasive. So we have this idea of message appeal, so the way that we appeal to our target audience. And we broadly can think of them in two ways. The first being informational, so rational appeals, which is a message strategy that's processed cognitively, and it focuses on practical, functional, utilitarian benefits. Essentially, what is the logical reason as to why you should buy our product? So it's often a very explicit overview of what the behavioral exchange is going to be. Here's how much our product costs, and here's the value it will bring to you. And that value is going to be worth to you far more than the money that you spend on buying our product. Therefore, you should buy our product. And these sorts of appeals work really well when it's a high involvement decision, like buying a house or buying a car. High involvement means that there's a lot of cognitive thinking going into it. And usually the sorts of products that are high involvement are products that are, they have a big opportunity cost, either because they cost a lot of money or because there's really important negative consequences of making the wrong decision. So yeah, informational appeals, rational appeals. We use these all the time. These are your product disclosure statements when you're talking about like finance. These are, like the websites that have all the terms and the details. But these are also the television advertisements that focus on price and quality and really, like I said, spelling out that exchange that you're going to get. In exchange for money, you're going to get this, and here is how much it's going to benefit you. The other type of appeal, or rather the other type of broad category of appeal that we talk about a lot in IMC, is transformational or emotional appeals. Emotional appeals being the umbrella term, transformational specifically referring to the concept that an advertisement can create an emotion and an emotional reaction that can then be activated and sort of played upon later when it comes to making that purchase decision. You'll think about that positive emotional experience you had listening to our message appeal, and it will make you more likely to purchase our product. So you'll see a lot of advertisements, particularly in recent years, really tapping into a lot of like social justice issues. And obviously there's the reading of that assumes the best about marketers, which is that these companies care very deeply about social issues. And I have no doubt that that's true, particularly for companies like Nike that have such a strong history of supporting athletes, particularly athletes of color. But then there's also the sort of cynical take on these things, which is that they're trying to create a transformational appeal. They're trying to make you feel that the brand stands for something so that you have a more positive emotional engagement with the brand, and it changes the way that you think about purchasing the product. And obviously when people see through that, as was the case with, you know, the Gillette razors ad, the best a man can be, it can create the opposite intent. You have this negative emotional reaction to the brand that colors the rest of your experience and interactions. So transformational appeals and emotional appeals in general, they're processed emotionally, and they focus on connecting with psychological needs. A lot of the time, you still are going to be creating a bit of an argument to do with the exchange, but instead of focusing on the utilitarian benefits of the exchange, you know, here's how much value you're going to get out of it, we're kind of creating this often not completely verbal, right? Not entirely tangible, spelt out argument, but we are nonetheless creating an argument that you will be getting some positive emotional experience in exchange. I keep bringing it up, but the classic example is Coca-Cola and happiness. They're not talking about the functional characteristics of the product. They're talking instead about this emotional connection that the brand has with nostalgia and happiness and summer, and hoping that these things will excite you and activate you when you go to purchase the product. So yeah, like I said, rational appeals, emotional appeals, two broad categories of appeals. And the purpose of using these is to tap into our consumer insight, understand what it is that our consumers think about and need and desire, what is it that influences their decision-making in this product category, and then come up with a very persuasive message that is going to convince them to buy our product. So how these look in practice, right? Informational appeal, a rational appeal, doesn't necessarily have to be very dry and boring and fact-based. It's about the underlying message. So we'll very quickly look at, here we go, this campaign. It's a classic. Hopefully a lot of you guys will have seen it growing up. Yep, let's get rid of this one. But yeah, it's a 2 and 5 fruit and veg campaign. So we'll just watch it. Let me know if you have any issues with sound.
You know how everyone's telling us to eat less? Well, I'm here to tell you to eat more. More fruit and more vegetables. We all know that fruit and veggies are an important part of healthy eating. They're packed full of vitamins and minerals. And healthy eating can help protect against heart disease, lowers your risk of cancer, diabetes, and helps maintain a healthy weight. You need 2 serves of fruit and 5 serves of veggies every day. Combine this with regular physical activity, and soon you'll be looking as good as me.
So yeah, old school classic ad, you can see that it uses as a creative strategy a lot of humor appeals as a way of cutting through the clutter. But at its core, its message strategy is a very rational one. They just spell out over the course of this video, here are all the health benefits associated with eating right. And this is why it's so important for you to eat better. And so this humor appeal isn't actually about creating some emotional state that gets activated later. It's not a transformational message strategy. Instead, this humor appeal is a creative decision that's been made in order to make this message strategy more salient, so you pay attention to it. So like I said, a rational appeal doesn't have to be some boring, dry spreadsheet. It's all about the message that is underneath the advertisement. What is it the advertisement saying? And in this case, it's saying, here are the benefits to healthy eating. This is why you should eat healthy. But other types of advertisements exist, obviously, emotional appeals. So we're going to look at another government ad, stop it at the start, and we'll see how an emotional strategy plays out. It's a bit different.
It's okay. He's just being a boy.
Don't worry, Mum. I know it's okay for boys to push girls.
Yeah, and when I grow up, I guess it'll be okay if I'm violent with women.
Sorry, that's not what I meant.
So again, like an emotional advertisement, it doesn't have to be about creating these positive emotional experiences to drive behavior change. It all depends on what is the message that we're trying to impart and what's the behavior that we're trying to change. And in this case, obviously trying to get people to reconsider the language that they use around children as a way of making sure that we're not accidentally normalizing quite harmful gender stereotypes. So rational appeals and emotional appeals are not just cookie cutter approaches. There's a lot of nuance within these things. And it just depends on what is the type of argument that we're making, what is the type of argument that's going to be most persuasive to our audience. And that is a decision that we base primarily off of understanding who our audience is and what insights are driving their behavior. You know, why is it that they behave the way that they behave? And then you combine marketing theory with that understanding of your target audience, as well as an understanding of your competitors and your own product, to arrive at this argument around why they should change their behavior in the way that you want them to. If it's a government, obviously changing their behavior to some pro-social end. And if you're working for a company, then it's all about changing their behavior to consume your product or consume more of your product even. So as I say, advertising is all about being persuasive, right? And we use these different appeals in different ways to persuade people to take actions either now or in the future. And so a big part of advertising then is being persuasive. So we use whatever theories we can regarding being persuasive. And one of the more prevalent, particularly within marketing communications, is a very old one. It's Aristotle's modes of persuasion. Now, Aristotle, when he wrote these things back in ancient Greece, he was talking primarily about the way that politicians and philosophers might use words and arguments in order to sway people to particular courses of action. But at its core, persuasion doesn't really, the core ideas of persuasion are across all types of media. And so we in marketing use these a lot when it comes to trying to decide on the best message strategy to persuade people of a particular course of action. So there are 4 types of persuasion, but in marketing, we really only talk about 3. The last one, Kairos, is all about appealing to, now is the moment. And often in marketing, we consider that to be part of our logos or part of our, the next one is pathos, emotional appeals. So we won't worry too much about that. We'll just focus on these first 3, logos, pathos, and ethos. So logos is all about logical or rational appeals. So it's about showing the probability of what is likely to happen as a result of, for instance, using our products, creating a rational argument as to why they should be taking the behavior that we want them to. So that 2 and 5 campaign from the New South Wales government, classic example of that, spelling out, here is the probability of what's going to happen if you consume more fruit and veg. And this is why that's a good thing for you. Therefore, you should eat more fruit and veg. And it's a style of persuasion that focuses on claims, evidence, and warrants, right? Like proof of your arguments in order to persuade your audience that you are correct. The next type of persuasion, the next mode of persuasion is pathos. So this is all about emotional appeals. And it's about considering the emotions of those in your audience and understanding what emotional state your audience needs to be in order for them to take the course of action that you want them to take. So this is often very powerful in the short term, creating an emotional state that makes them more likely to take a particular course of action. But maintaining that emotional state over a long period of time is very difficult, particularly if that emotional state is just a reaction to your message strategy, because that means that your message strategy pretty much has to be delivered at the moment where the decision is being made. So you often have pathos, emotional appeals followed by a call to action immediately, like call this number now and you can help, or, pick up the phone and donate, all this sort of stuff. Finally, we have ethos. This one's a bit more difficult for marketers to pull off, but you see this a lot in politics, particularly modes of persuasion. It's appeal to the credibility of the presenter. So it's projecting the idea that the speaker is trustworthy. And this is often a very long-term persuasive strategy where you establish yourself as an expert in a particular field and therefore giving additional credibility to what it is that you're saying. This is often described as an appeal to authority, and there's a lot of different types of authority, not just the sort of authority that comes with force that you might think of when someone mentions authority, but also authority to do with, someone's personality or their status as an expert. And brands do use this from time to time, establishing themselves as the trusted name in blah, blah, blah. They don't necessarily have to show logic for that or argument for that. It's just a claim that builds up over time with their reputation. And then they can trade in on that reputation to add additional persuasive power to the arguments that they're making. The other thing that's important to note about these modes of persuasion is that they're interchangeable. When you're making a persuasive argument, it's quite likely that you're going to draw on all of these 3 different modes of persuasion, particularly as you appeal to various sections of your audience. You'll identify what are the modes of persuasion that are going to help me in this moment in time. And so a campaign will often have multiple parts, right? So, if again we go back and consider the humor appeal that was used in that 2 and 5, in a lot of respects, you might describe humor as an emotional appeal. They're trying to sort of demonstrate this idea that part of the benefits of eating healthy is that you will be a healthier person, almost like spiritually, right? Like it'll make you happier to be healthy. So they create this positive, upbeat message. So there is this emotional appeal mode of persuasion in there, even though we would say that the overarching message strategy is a rational based appeal. So again, like most marketing theory, there are a lot of edge cases, and it is often the case that an argument has multiple modes of persuasion. And this is well supported in the literature as well. They are invariably interrelated and interdependent as well. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to do a group activity where we look at Aristotle's modes of persuasion, and we look at how this plays into marketing right now, and particularly this idea that it's interconnected, right? That an advertisement is going to have multiple types. So what I'm going to get you guys here to do, just while we're all together now, is have a look at this. It's an extract from the World Vision Organization's website, and this is just like part of a page trying to convince people to donate money to sponsor a child. So part of their quite famous child sponsorship sort of program, where you provide a monthly payment to give a child education and help support the needs of them and the villages and towns where they live. So, here's how child sponsorship is helping kids right now. What I'm going to get you guys to do, and feel free to just unmute yourselves and call out with your thoughts on this, but I want you to identify the logos, the pathos, and the ethos. So maybe if we start off here, what parts of this advertisement do you guys think are logical appeals? Does anyone want to point those out and highlight what they think are the logical appeals in this? So Emily says the stats. Yeah, here we go, right? Like it's keeping our costs down means your gifts make the biggest waves possible, right? 87% of our money goes to programs. Absolutely, that's a big part of it. Any other parts of this that would be part of the logos appeal?
Would it be how, like they're saying up the top, like here's how sponsorship is helping kids right now?
Yeah, absolutely. This is the logical argument as to why. So this perhaps more than anything else is the logos, right? Kids are empowered to choose their sponsors. Now sponsorship programs in the communities are helping meet urgent needs, preventing the spread of COVID-19 and building resilience for the future. It's making this logical argument. If you give us money, you are going to be helping these people survive the pandemic. You're going to help these people have agency, and yeah, absolutely. So what about pathos? What about these emotional appeals? Which parts of this ad do you think are appealing to your sense of emotion?
The pictures where the children are all smiling.
Yeah, absolutely, right? Mm-hmm. And you'll see this a lot when we talk about an emotional appeal. It's often non-verbal, right? It's all these happy children and sort of that implication of, well, if you pay money to sponsor a child, you'll be spreading joy throughout the world. And yeah, Olivia says the kids embracing at the bottom, right? Like hugging. It's showing the vulnerability of these people and their need to be helped, but then also the joy that you'll be able to bring to them by contributing to this program. Now, what about ethos? What about appeals to authority or appeals to the sort of like credibility of the organization? Which parts of this do you think are making that ethos appeal? Yeah, we're a Christian humanitarian organization. We're motivated by faith in Christ. In fact, pretty much this whole bit here is an appeal to their credibility as an organization. Even this bit here, there's a part of this that is logos, right? Because it's talking about sort of like, this is how your money is going to help people. It's not going to help us. It's going to go, 87% is going to go to programs. But in a lot of respects, the reason why they're making this argument here about how much money goes to programs rather than the rest going to management is about demonstrating their credibility as a charitable organization. So yeah, you can see there's all these different parts here We have the emotional images, the emotional text. We have the evidence, including, you know, like how things are going to be improving because of your donation. We have the trustworthy and the credibility of the organization. And so even on this one page, you can see that we're bringing together all these different modes of persuasion to make a compelling argument as to why you should give World Vision them the money to help sponsor kids in need. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to split you guys up into different groups. We're going to do some breakout room activities, because like I said, even though there's a lot of different modes of persuasion, we do have a message strategy that is at play. And I want you to identify what is the dominant appeal, you know, what is the type of message strategy that's being employed by World Vision, and of course, by other charities as well. And then I'm going to ask you a question which ties into this sort of next decision category about media strategy. Considering that appeal, what is going to be the best media channel when it comes to making that appeal? What channel is the best way for disseminating that message? So like I said, I'm going to stick you guys in some breakout rooms now. So let's have a look. 3 to 4 per room. Yeah, perfect. All right. So I'm going to open up 6 rooms. If you have any issues, just jump back and I'll put you into another room, or mention it in chat where you want to go. But I'll open these rooms. I'll give you guys a fair bit of time to talk about this because there's a few different appeals and different media strategies that are possible. And then when we get back, I'm going to get you guys. So just make sure that there's at least one person in your group who's happy and confident enough to speak to everyone else to mention what is the media that's most appropriate and why you think that that's the case. All right. Best of luck. I'll see you guys in 5 minutes. Mozambique, yeah. All right, g'day, and welcome back. Just waiting on a few others to join us from the other breakout rooms. But we might get started. Does anyone want to jump in and chime in with what their group thought the dominant appeal used by World Vision was?
We thought that it would be the ethos. Ethos? Yeah. Pathos. Sorry.
Yes. So ethos is appeal to like authority and credibility. Pathos is an appeal to emotions. So you think it was an emotional-based appeal then?
Yeah, we thought it was definitely.
So what do you think are the key reasons why they've gone with an emotional appeal? And what do you think is the most sort of obvious evidence that they've gone for this emotional appeal?
I feel like it just would really, like with an emotional appeal, especially with something like World Vision, you'd be able to get a lot of broad, like everyone will be emotional about World Vision and donating and poor children overseas. So I feel like it would definitely reach a larger target market and demographic in that way.
Mm-hmm.
So it would definitely be like the strongest leg to stand on, I suppose.
Okay. So it appeals to a wider range of audiences than if you were to do like a rational appeal. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, that's what we all like agreed on in our group.
Okay. No, so that's a very interesting. So let's say we made a rational appeal, right? And I guess the rational appeal for this sort of an organization would be it alleviates human suffering and there's some intrinsic good to that. And this is the most effective way that you can use your money to alleviate human suffering. So we're talking about here's a behavioral exchange. Here's how it will benefit the world and society. And you are a part of society, so you have some interest in that, I guess. That you don't think that would be particularly like it wouldn't appeal to as large a group of people, or is it?
No, I think that it would. I think that it would definitely still appeal to a lot of people, but it might they might switch some people off in that manner, like because of a lot of like informational kind of like advertisements or any sort of like advertising like that. People could turn a blind eye to it, whereas I feel like an emotional really like grabs people. It's gripping. There's lots of good, like lots of not good, like emotive music, and it would maybe drive people to be more attentive towards that advertisement.
Yeah, that's true. And I guess that there is, I can't remember the actual term for it. No, it's completely gone. But there is a sort of finite limit to human empathy. They talk about sort of human societies being structured around being able to have empathy for a set amount of people. For most people, it's sort of like only around 20, maybe up to 60. But it's not infinite, right? If you hear about someone dying tragically on the news, it might affect you emotionally, but it's not going to affect you emotionally the same way that it would if you heard that, you know, your sibling had died in a tragic accident, or your parents had died in a tragic accident. So there is some really obvious intuitive sense to the idea that there is some limit to human empathy that people closer to us we feel closer to. And so you are right, there might actually be some hard limit to making some persuasive logical argument. Well, if you give us this money, we're going to do this amazing thing for these people on the other side of the world. There might be a logical reason as to why that's a good thing, but it might not necessarily be the most persuasive, because you don't yet have an emotional connection to these people. You don't even know that they exist, at least not as individuals. You haven't met any of them, which is why I think, yeah, you are right. This emotional appeal might have a slightly broader appeal because it's creating that emotional connection. It's showing you these people. So it doesn't rely on that existing value structure being in place. Did anyone else have any other views about the type of appeal used or the reasoning behind that appeal? For instance, are there any other benefits to an emotional appeal that we haven't talked about?
One thing we rationalized it with was that it's a really competitive market in Australia, particularly for charities. So having an emotional appeal helps you to cut through some of the noise.
That's very true, particularly when you're talking about there being a lot of other charities in Australia, because I think that is actually a very important thing to note. I'm sure a lot of you guys have had the experience back in the before days, before COVID, walking through the city and being accosted by various street sort of salesmen trying to get you to donate to this or that charity. The charities that they work for are almost all of them fantastic charities that you would usually love to support. But there is something about being accosted and having that argument sort of blasted at you that kind of immediately makes you shut down and shut off. And so, yeah, I think that there is that potential threat, that there is so much noise when it comes to this product category, this charity category, that you have a very real chance of having your message be lost in that noise, and people don't pay attention to it. So yeah, emotions are a very good way of cutting through the clutter. And it's why you see a lot of ads today are all about this narrative storytelling, highly emotional, because increasingly advertisers have recognized that, and this is something that is an ongoing media topic, is that people have a lot more control over the advertising that they consume. They have the ability to skip ads on YouTube. They have the ability to tab out on auto-playing ads. They have the ability to turn off and mute things. And because of the rise of streaming services, increasingly the way that people watch TV now, it doesn't even have advertisement at all. People are paying for the content directly and skipping the ads. Which means that a lot of the time, if we want people to watch our ads, we have to make it engaging. And emotions have a lot of that engagement factor, which is very true. Although, interestingly, particularly speaking of charities, there is the idea of emotional burnout and the idea that a very negative emotional experience, showing some child starving in Africa, the first time you see that, your heart kind of weeps for that. But eventually you become numb to it, and it ceases to have an emotional impact. And there's a lot of research that, particularly in the charity sphere, shows that these negative emotional ads pretty much don't have any impact anymore, because people just almost reflectively, as a defensive mechanism, stop paying attention to the ad straight away, because they don't want to be put into that negative emotional state. And so there's a lot of interesting ethical arguments around the use of ethics, the use of emotions as a persuasive strategy, because some emotions have negative consequences if you feel them for too long. And that's kind of been argued as one of the big failures, I guess, of the sort of modern media landscape, is that a lot of the time we're putting people into emotional states of discomfort and unease, and that they don't have enough and that they're not sufficient. And we do this to make people feel as though, well, if I bought this product, it might solve that problem. And so there are ethical consequences, I guess, to that use of emotions. So I think we're all pretty much on board with this idea that it's an emotional strategy that's being played up. Obviously, they've got all these other modes of persuasion, but the central message is all around this emotional appeal, doing this nice thing for other people. When it comes to that message strategy, what do you think is the best media to use? How do you best sort of deliver on a emotional message strategy?
Maybe TV, because it's a mix of the music and the visuals and everything. Pulls on the heartstrings of the viewers. Yeah,
absolutely. So you're mentioning television because it has this, the ability to have music and video. Why do you think that's so important to creating an emotional message?
I suppose music kind of conditions you to feel a certain way, and then I suppose seeing the visuals of the kids, you associate with that. I don't know if that's correct, but
no, I think that's absolutely spot on. Particularly talking about music being sort of associated with moods. You'll find that a lot of the time the sort of creative aspect of advertising is all about understanding the non-verbal visual and audio elements of communication, where you can make someone feel a certain thing. I mean, we've all cried in a Pixar film, right? Like these characters that don't exist still somehow manage to make us feel something, because there's a combination of audio cues and visual imagery that makes you feel an emotion. Of course, we can use that exact same technology, that exact same psychology in an advertisement to make someone feel something. And you're right, it's that combination of visual and audio and dynamic movement too, that makes television, that makes video online very, very, very good avenues for this type of persuasive message. What do you think would be some bad media forms then, if we wanted to use this sort of a message strategy?
Print media?
Print media?
Yeah, maybe because as you said, that people are getting fed up with, like only pictures and they don't feel connected anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly long form written word can be quite a powerful way of expressing emotion. And, there's some very powerful poetry, for instance, that can conjure emotional states. Even something as short as a haiku or something is able to create an emotional state. But you're absolutely right. It is more difficult. It requires a lot more nuance, and particularly in an advertisement where people are very unlikely to read an advertisement. They're really only interested in the visuals, like the picture, I guess. It can be very difficult to create an emotional response. A lot of the time you'll see print advertisements are much more focused on a rational strategy or even like an ethos strategy where it's, like the trusted name in whatever, where it's all about just getting a very simple message out there that they can understand through the written word. Whereas, the more dynamic, the more sort of range of persuasive techniques that can be deployed, usually the better. So Olivia points out radio, very similar. It's very difficult to make someone emotional just on the basis of audio. So even though we talked about the power of music to make someone feel emotional, and that's absolutely true, it's even more powerful if you combine it with visuals. And so if you're in radio, you're sort of playing with one hand tied behind your back. It's possible, just as it's possible to do it in print, but it is more difficult, which is why we talk about audio visual media being the most appropriate for an ethos style appeal. And Emily sort of points out that, this is the strength of video, is that it's very good for storytelling techniques. All right, cool. So thinking critically about modes of persuasion, we've talked a lot about the benefits of a pathos and emotional appeal. Does anyone want to suggest perhaps some disadvantages of an emotional appeal? What might be some of the challenges we'd face if we were trying to make people feel an emotion and use that to convince them to donate to World Vision? Because we did touch briefly on some of the negatives of a pathos appeal, but there are certainly plenty that we didn't mention.
Maybe some emotional appeal can, some people can, their perception of this emotional appeal may be different. Maybe they react negatively. I mean, like if you give me like pictures of, children starving in Africa, and I will feel like, I don't like it, or like it's...
Yes, yeah, absolutely. You can have a negative reaction to this idea of someone, I mean, quite cynically trying to force you to feel sad, right? It's quite natural for some people to feel defensive when these sorts of emotional appeals get used. And then they can kind of feel as though, well, what right do you have to make me feel like this? And like I said, right at the beginning of this tutorial, particularly like the Gillette Best a Man Can Get, right? Like, that ad is around a very serious issue, right? This topic of toxic masculinity. And they have I guess you would say, quite an important message to share about like the role that stereotypes have in perpetuating toxic masculinity. But while they were hoping that people would feel as though, Gillette, they're leading the way, like these are the change makers we need, instead they had this negative reaction when people were like, well, by what right do you have to champion this cause? You're a company that has perpetuated these negative stereotypes about men. That's been part of your business model for a very long time. And so you had this negative reaction to it. Because obviously when you're playing with people's emotions, there's a lot of extra volatility, and you really have to understand your target audience, like really have to understand your target audience to do it safely. So it involves a really in-depth knowledge of your brand as well as your audience. So yeah, very, very powerful. Emily says, disadvantage if you're a high involvement consumer that responds preferably to facts. Now that's an interesting point, right? We talk about high involvement decisions being better suited to logical arguments. The main reason why we say that, it's not necessarily that this type of audience prefers facts. It's more that the decision making is long term. when you're doing a high involvement decision process, you're not just making the decision right then and there. It's not like you're just, in this case, they're wanting you to call up straight away and donate the money. Instead, it's something that you're mulling over for weeks, sometimes months, in the case of, buying a house or buying a car. And so you need to be able to sustain that persuasive argument. And a pathos, emotional appeal, is very good at like punchy, immediate, getting that like emotional hit straight away and trying to get that sale straight away. But you can't sustain that emotion forever. And once that emotion fades, your persuasive power pretty much goes with it. So you need to make those logical arguments as well, is a very important part of it. Olivia mentions if the message is always negative, then people might feel depressed or hopeless. Yeah, absolutely. Particularly in regards to fear appeals, where you're convincing people that there's this awful threat out there. There's a lot of really good research on fear appeals actually to do with the sort of reflex that people have to a fear appeal, where they shut down, they protect their ego, they disassociate with the message. So in order for a fear appeal to be powerful and actually impactful, you need to give people a solution to that fear straight away, so that they don't feel that sense of hopelessness and dread. They instead just feel that call to action. Here's a threat, but don't worry, you can beat it. Here's how. And actually, one of the big concerns about a lot of coronavirus messaging that's come out from various government agencies is that we've gotten better at it now, where we talk more about like the positive things that you can do to help. But at the start, government messaging was not keeping pace with media messaging, and the media message was all about hopelessness and dread, and it caused people to shut off and disassociate. Whereas really what they needed to be hearing was, well, here's all these small practical things you can do to really drastically cut down on your risk of infection, both catching it and transmitting it. And so, yeah, you need to give people that positive response as well. Christy said, thinking from the perspective of disadvantages, there's also relation to information credibility. Some people will confuse whether or not it's true, whether or not it's a scam. Yeah, that's true. If someone's feeling emotional about something, and they go into that defensive mindset, they're immediately going to start looking for, I guess, gaps in your argument that they can use to protect themselves from this negative feeling that you're trying to inflict on them. And you see this all the time with messaging to do with message that challenges people on an ideological background. So, classic examples would be things like vaccination and climate change, right? Like if you try and come up with a persuasive argument to convince people that vaccines are good or climate change is happening, and you try and make these powerful emotional claims about like the importance of acting now, children will die, the planet will be ruined, all this sort of stuff. You do risk alienating your target audience if your argument is not perfectly credible. Because when someone goes into that defensive state, they will look for any chinks, even if those chinks aren't necessarily, true or realistic or like a fair representation of your arguments. They will go into that defensive mindset, and you need to be able to protect yourself, protect your argument from that reaction, or don't make an emotional appeal. Instead, go for something else. All right. So what about let's go for logos and ethos then, right? Logical appeals. We've talked about the fact that they're going to be very beneficial to sustained behavior change, because a logos argument has its benefits over time. So what about some of the disadvantages of a logical appeal then? Because I think we'll all appreciate, right? Most advertisements are based off emotional appeals. So there must be some disadvantages to a logical appeal, or you'd always go for it because it's more persuasive over time. What is the big disadvantage of a logical, rational-based appeal? Emily says it's not entertaining. Yeah, that's true. I mean, sometimes facts can be fun and entertaining, but a lot of the time, if they're presented dryly, yeah, you'll just ignore them. So Olivia says difficult to become effective. Well, it becomes difficult for them to be effective because of the fact that they're not inherently interesting. There's no drama to them. So it's very easy to present facts in a really boring way where it just gets lost. And something that we've talked about a lot is this idea of noise, right? There's so much clutter in the advertising landscape, in the media landscape, in the messaging sort of IMC landscape, that if your message doesn't stand out to people, they're not going to listen to it. So even if it might be persuasive over time, if only they would stop and listen to your very persuasive argument, you do have to understand as an advertiser, your audience does not owe you anything. They do not have to look at your ad, particularly nowadays, right? It's increasingly easy for them to ignore your ad. So you need to give them something. And a lot of the time what we're giving them is an emotional story. That's why they pay attention to it, right? Like trailers for a film, they're ads, but they're often some of the most viewed films on viewed sort of video clips on YouTube, because even though they're an ad, they're giving something to their audience, this excitement, this small self-contained story that hints at sort of this broader thing that they can enjoy. And so it becomes this very attention-grabbing thing. And that's harder for a logical appeal. Now, what about ethos, credibility? Because this isn't something that you see very often in advertising. Like I said, every so often you'll see the, like the trusted brand in whatever, but it's not always there. Why might that be? What are the advantages and disadvantages of a credibility-based appeal?
Would it be because like there's no, like when you like if you're basing a credible ad, like how do people know that it's credible? Would that be it? I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, 100%, right? The reason it's difficult to make an appeal based on credibility is that you have to prove that you're credible first. For some brands, that might be easy because they've got 100 years of history and they're already the leading brand in whatever. But for other brands, that's more difficult. And that's why you often see appeals on the basis of, like, look at all these positive reviews we have, or, over 1 million satisfied customers, trying to use sort of evidence to build a credibility argument. So it is very difficult because you need evidence to support that. And it's not just like a logical argument where you're presenting the evidence and et cetera, et cetera. You kind of need the audience to already know that evidence in order for it to be persuasive. They need to trust that you're credible before they trust your messaging around how credible you are. So it's kind of like a chicken egg situation. Amy says the credibility of speaker may be questionable. Yeah, absolutely. And particularly in advertising, right? No one trusts an advertisement. And a lot of the time there's a lot of distrust around reviews, even, the idea of review bombing, or bot reviewing, getting positive reviews by paying for them. This is something that undermines people's trust in these proven sort of evidence of credibility. And so, it's increasingly difficult to make a credibility-based appeal. But why might you want to make a credibility-based appeal? What would be the advantage of it?
Like getting the donations, I suppose. Like people would trust you enough to donate more money, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's vital for a charity because people already have this mistrust of organizations. So you have to be able to prove that it's a good idea to give us your money, that it'll be safe with us. There are benefits to an ethos-based appeal. It makes people feel safer with you, and it's really long-term, right? A lot of the time, ethos-based appeals end up being tied into like morality, what's right and wrong, or this sort of a thing. We've kind of run a little bit over, so I'll just wrap things up there. But I think it is important to think about these things, particularly when it comes to contemplating your hot topic, right? Think critically about what's happening in these different areas. Media strategy, message strategy. We've touched on a lot of ideas as to things that are changing in the IMC landscape in these things. So do consider these things. I'm sure Frank will talk about these things more in the lecture. So I wish you all the best with that. Next week, we will be doing our measuring IMC effects sort of unit, and then we will also be giving you a bit more Q&A for the portfolio assessment. So best of luck with that. Enjoy the lecture, and I'll see you guys next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you.